Have you ever looked around your life and thought, why do I suddenly feel so disconnected from everything that used to feel normal? And the strange thing is, sometimes this feeling shows up not when things are falling apart, but when you're finally becoming more yourself. Not because anything terrible happened, not because you're isolated, not because you're alone. In fact, sometimes this feeling shows up when you're becoming more yourself than ever before. And that's the part nobody talks about. You can be growing and still feel lonely. And that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Maybe you've felt it. You sit in a room full of people you genuinely care about and still feel disconnected. You leave certain conversations feeling strangely empty. And you look at your life and think, why does everything feel different lately? And why don't I seem to fit what I used to fit? Did I make the wrong choices? Am I becoming too different? Most people think this feeling means something has gone wrong. And I don't think that's what's happening at all. Because sometimes the loneliness you're feeling isn't a detour, it's a transition. And once you understand the difference, you start experiencing this season very differently. In these conversations, I want to give you a name to something many women experience quietly. Why growth can feel lonely, why clarity can temporarily make life feel smaller, and why this season you're in might not be evidence that something is wrong with you. It might actually be evidence that something is finally going right. Here's the first thing I want you to know. I don't think the problem is the loneliness. I think the problem is that most women misdiagnose the loneliness they're experiencing. Because loneliness and being alone are not the same thing. Some of the loneliest women I've ever met were surrounded by people. And some of the most peaceful women I've ever met spend a lot of time by themselves. Because this isn't really about proximity, it's about resonance, and it's about whether the life around you still reflects who you are becoming. And one thing I've noticed repeatedly, both in my own life and in conversations with women and clients around the world, is that the moment a woman becomes more honest about what she needs, the world often gets smaller before it gets bigger. And not because she is becoming difficult, because she is becoming discerning. And what most people miss, the old chapter often closes faster than the new one arrives. And that gap, that space in between, is where so much of this loneliness lives. Not because you're broken, not because you've failed, but because you're in transition. If you happen to have something nice and warm in your hands right now, a lovely coffee or your favorite tea or matcha, perfect timing. This one is worth slowing down for. And if you're new here, welcome, I'm Eva, and I create deep conversations, powerful practical tools, and honest reflections for women who want to reconnect with themselves, refine their inner world, feel more radiant, and build a life that feels beautiful from the inside out. Because I genuinely believe two things. One, most women don't need fixing. They need returning. And two, self-refinement doesn't have to feel heavy. It can be beautiful. So welcome here. I'm really happy you're here. And before we go deeper, I want to say something that might genuinely relieve you. If you've been feeling more disconnected lately, if you've been questioning yourself, if certain places, conversations, friendships, or environments just don't feel the way they used to, there's a reason. And one of the most important things I want to help you understand today is how to tell the difference between being lonely and being between chapters. Because those are not the same thing. And confusing them creates a lot of unnecessary suffering. And if this kind of conversation feels like home to you, you probably want to stay here. I think one of the reasons this experience feels so confusing is because nobody really talks about it. Most conversations about loneliness focus on isolation, not having people or not having relationships, not having connection. And those experiences are absolutely real. But there is another kind of loneliness that shows up during growth. And it's much harder to explain because on paper, everything looks fine. You still have friends. You still have people around you. Nothing dramatic happened. And yet, something feels different. And maybe you experienced this. You're sitting at dinner with people that you've known for years. Everyone is talking. Everyone is laughing. And there's a quiet part of you thinking, why do I suddenly feel so far away? And not because anyone hurt you. And not because anything is technically wrong. You're physically in the room, but emotionally, it already feels like you've left. And it's a strange experience. And I went through a period like this as well. I kept leaving certain conversations with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Nobody had done anything wrong. I still care deeply about the people involved. But I kept feeling like I was on the other side of a glass. I was present, but not quite there. And I remember thinking, what's wrong with me? But I actually realized nothing was wrong. I wasn't becoming disconnected. I was becoming different. And those are very different experiences. Sometimes the loneliness isn't about lacking connection. Sometimes it's about outgrowing the places where connection used to happen. And in the moment, I want to talk about something that genuinely surprises most women. Because what actually creates this loneliness is very different from what we've been taught. I think one of the reasons we struggle with this experience so much is because we treat all loneliness as if it's the same thing. But it isn't. There are actually very different experiences hiding under the same word. And understanding which one you're in changes everything. Think about it in this way. Imagine go to the doctor, just to give you an example, with a broken arm and being given medicine for a headache. It's a silly example, I know, but it's easier to understand. So it doesn't matter how good the solution is. It's solving the wrong problem. And I think that's exactly what many women do with this loneliness. They keep trying to fix something that doesn't need fixing because they never identify what kind of loneliness it actually is. So let me give you a little map. The first is situational loneliness. This is the one most people understand. You move somewhere new, a relationship ends, your circumstances change, and because your circumstances change, you temporarily feel alone. The cause is visible, and the solution is usually visible too. New people, new routines, and eventually life settles again. And most of us have been there, and most of us found our way through it. Then we have the type number 2, social loneliness. This one feels different because people are around you, but you don't feel seen. You don't feel known. You don't feel met. You're sitting at a dinner, everyone is laughing, and somehow you still feel completely alone. Not because nobody is physically there, but because nobody is meeting you where you actually are. Connection and proximity are not the same thing. Being surrounded and being understood are very different experiences. And then there is the third type. The one I think many women watching this are actually in. Growth loneliness. This isn't the loneliness of lacking people. It isn't the loneliness of being unseen. It's the loneliness of transition. It's the loneliness of no longer recognizing the room you used to feel at home in. You no longer fit where you used to fit, but you haven't fully discovered where you fit next. So the old version of you is gone enough that you can't comfortably go backwards. But the new chapter hasn't fully materialized yet. And that creates a strange kind of emptiness. An emptiness many women mistake for failure. But here's what I want you to hear. Growth loneliness is actually evidence that you're moving. Not in the wrong direction, just moving. And that's a very different story. And in a moment, I want to talk about something that generally surprises most women. Because the women who feel this most intensely are often the women who are closest to genuine alignment. And I think that explanation changes everything. Here's something I've noticed. The more disconnected we are from ourselves, the more things feel acceptable. The more connected we become, the fewer things do. Not because we are becoming difficult, and not because we are becoming demanding, but because we're becoming honest. And honesty changes everything. Think about it. When you don't know yourself very well, almost anything can look right. Almost any relationship, almost any friendship, almost any environment. Because there isn't much discernment operating. But once you become clearer, you start noticing things, conversations that drain you, dynamics that require you to shrink, relationships where you constantly perform instead of connect, environments where honesty is quietly punished, or friendships that depend on you never changing. And suddenly, what once felt normal doesn't feel normal anymore. And here is what I think is so important to say. Not every uncomfortable season is a sign to leave. Sometimes it's a sign you're becoming more honest. The difference matters. Discomfort from growth and discomfort from misalignment feel similar, but they lead in very different directions. The most self-aware women often feel the most alone. And not because something is wrong with them, but because clarity reduces options. And they stopped accepting the ones that don't fit. That's not a flaw. That's discernment operating correctly. And sometimes growth loneliness happens because your inner standards changed. And they changed before your outer world had time to catch up. Your conversations haven't changed yet. Your environment hasn't changed yet. And some of your relationships haven't changed yet. But you have. And the gap between who you're becoming inside and what still surrounds you outside, that's where so much of this loneliness lives. Because awareness changes what you've available for. And once you've become aware, you can't pretend you aren't. And I'm genuinely curious, have you experienced this kind of loneliness? Not from being physically alone, but from feeling that you've outgrown something. Maybe a friendship or an environment or a version of yourself. Leave it in the comment, I would love to know and connect. And if someone comes to mind while you're listening, maybe a friend or a sister, a mom, or a woman quietly navigating her own transition as well, share this with her. One conversation can make someone feel less alone, and that's why we're here. I want to tell you what I think is actually happening. Because I don't think you're as lost as you feel. I think you're standing in one of the strangest seasons of personal growth. The space between versions of yourself. The old version of you has dissolved enough that you can't comfortably return to her. But the new chapter hasn't fully arrived yet. And that creates a very particular feeling. Difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it yet, because from the outside, your life might look completely normal, but from the inside, everything feels different. Things that once excites you don't land the same way. Things you once tolerated feel impossible to ignore. People you once felt completely comfortable with now create a subtle distance you can't quite explain. And what makes this so uncomfortable is that there isn't always anything concrete to point at. You can't always explain what's wrong. Because sometimes nothing is wrong. Something is simply ending. And endings don't always announce themselves dramatically. Sometimes they arrive quietly. Not as an ending, as a feeling, as a loss of resonance, as a subtle discomfort, as a feeling that you've outgrown something you once loved. And even when those things no longer fit, there can still be grief. And I want to say something about that grief, because I think it gets overlooked. Sometimes what you're grieving isn't just the relationship or the friendship or the environment. It's the version of you that knew how to survive inside it. The version who fit, who understood the rules, who belonged there. And losing hair, even when it's right, deserves to be acknowledged. Many women judge themselves for this. And they think, if this is the right direction, why does it feel sad? But those two things are not opposites. Something can be right for you and still be difficult to let go of. I had a period in my own life where I felt like I was living between two worlds. The old one didn't quite fit anymore. The new one wasn't visible yet. And that season felt far lonelier than I expected. Not because nobody loved me, but because I couldn't fully relate to who I had been, and I couldn't yet see who I was becoming. And that in between, that's where I think many women quietly find themselves. Not in failure, not in confusion, in transition. And here's the reframe that changed everything for me. What if the discomfort isn't coming from being lost? What if it's coming from the fact that you are expanding? What if things feel strange because your old life was built around an older version of you, and now you're becoming someone she could never have been? That's not failure, that's evolution. And before we close, there is one thing I want to come back to, because most women spend this chapter trying to escape it. And I think that's the one mistake worth talking about. So let's talk about the gap, because I think we misunderstand it. And we treat it like a waiting room, a place to get through as quickly as possible. When I find my people, when a relationship arrives, when life finally feels aligned, then I'll be okay. But you do not have to force the next chapter open before it's ready. Because what if this chapter isn't just a bridge? What if it's actually part of the destination? Something important is happening here. Something many women skip. You're building a relationship with yourself, not the version who performs, not the version who adapts, and not the version who belongs by abandoning herself. The real one. And that relationship changed everything that comes next. The gap is where self-trust gets built, where discernment gets treatment, where standards become embodied. It's where you stop asking, what will make people stay? And start asking, what feels true to me? And that question changes your entire life. And growth doesn't only take things away, it also refines where you belong. The woman who eventually built relationships, communities, and lives they once thought they only existed for other people, almost spent some time here first. Not because they failed, but because they refused to build the next chapter from the wrong foundation. And maybe that's what this season is offering you. Not punishment, not isolation, preparation. Because what you're making room for requires a version of you who knows who she is. If you're craving more conversations like this slower kind, the honest kind, I've created something called the Glow Letters, which is a quieter space for women who care about growth, emotional depth, and becoming more themselves. If this resonated, I created something specifically for this season you're in. It's called Aligned by Design. It's a self-coaching playbook with my guidance and beautiful bonuses as well for the woman who wants to begin the real inner work but doesn't know where to start. It's practical, honest, it's a framework you return to for years. And if you want to start for free, there is also a beautiful gift for you, waiting for you, which is a 3-day reset experience. You can also have a look. You can do it on your own pace. It's yours if you decide to. Before we finish, I want to leave you with one thought. The next time loneliness shows up, instead of immediately asking, what's wrong with me? Try asking, what might this be making room for? Because every meaningful chapter requires space before it arrives. Because sometimes the discomfort isn't evidence that you've made a mistake. Sometimes it's evidence that you've stopped settling, that you've become honest enough to notice what no longer fits, that you are standing between two versions of your life. I know that space can feel uncomfortable. I know it can feel uncertain. And I know there are moments when it can feel incredibly lonely. But I hope after this conversation, you stop using the word broken. Because I don't think that's what this is. I think you're becoming more discerning, more honest, more aligned, more yourself. And while that process isn't always comfortable, it's beautiful. And by the way, you're not alone. You can join our community, where we are all together, growing together and supporting each other. The women who eventually build extraordinary relationships, extraordinary lives, extraordinary levels of self-trust, often spend time exactly where you are now. Not because they failed, but because they refused to build the next chapter from the wrong foundation. And that is brave, much braver than most people realize. So if this season feels lonely sometimes, please don't assume it's permanent. Growth loneliness is temporary, but might be necessary. And what it's making room for is not. Once you've understood this loneliness, once you've stopped seeing it as a flaw, something interesting starts to happen. A different question begins to appear. Because what becomes fascinating is this. The same woman who is incredible self-aware can still find herself attracted to something she already knows isn't right for her. Still drawn to certain dynamics. Still pulled toward familiar patterns, even when she's done the inner work. Even when she knows better. Not because she's broken, not because she's failing, but because she is mistaking something for love that isn't actually love at all. And I think understanding that changes everything. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next episode. What she no longer confuses with love. And honestly, it might be one of the most important conversations in this entire series. So I'll see you there. Thank you for being here. You're not late, you're not behind, and you're certainly not broken. Welcome back to yourself.